Today's emerging adults face a monstrous enemy: drugs. Drugs are one of the primary hindrances of proper brain development and brain functionality in young people. And with the percentage of young people using and abusing drugs, it seems impossible to prevent them and even to help them overcome drug addiction. But is it really impossible? I invite you to stay tuned to today's episode as I talk about this very prevalent issue with my good friend, teacher, and former probation officer Diane Sjuts as she shares with us her expertise in this field and offers practical advice to young people to help them overcome drug addiction and go towards a better future.
It is a mentality that shuns excuses and focuses on what's at stake. A mindset that resolves within itself that you must totally empty yourself to experience victory. A memory that remembers that who and what you are playing for is bigger than you.
So, Ms. Diane, I'm glad to have you on the show today. How are you?
I'm good. Glad to be here.
What I want to do as we begin is just give you a brief opportunity to just introduce yourself to the audience and so they can get a chance to know you better.
All right. Well, I'm Diane Sjuts, and I am a full-time instructor at Metro Community College here in Omaha. I share that responsibility with another job there as the director of the criminal justice program. So I like to say that I'm the dean's helper, but that I probably do a little bit more than that. But I have been teaching for 15 years. But prior to my teaching criminal justice at Metro, I was the Chief Probation Officer in Fremont. I had a district about probably, I would say I had 6 counties, and then I had 14 probation officers, and we had probably around 5,000 people on probation. Probably a fourth of those were juveniles.
Obviously, I think that you are the perfect person for this topic. As you know, our topic is against all odds. And this is essentially a redemption story. As we begin, I want to just briefly introduce Alton Voss. He's a young man whose addiction to drugs really cost him everything, seemingly everything that he lived for, everything that he believed in. And so in high school, Alton was a phenomenal football player. He ranked in at number 26 in the state of, or in the nation, and like number 3 or 4 in the state of Florida. And he played the quarterback position. So he was a pretty, phenomenal guy, a great athlete. He received all the accolades. He was praised around campus, and he eventually received a full scholarship to the University of South Florida.
Wow.
But when he got there for the summer practices, he was redshirted, so he didn't get a chance to play right away. It did something to his ego. He lost a lot of confidence. He began to really just hate football. So shortly after, he began to get into the party life. He got heavily involved with alcohol, started drinking a lot, and he started hanging around the wrong crowd. And then he began to introduce, pills into his life. And one of the pills that he added was oxycodone. Got addicted, obviously, began, taking some 360 pills over the course of a month. Eventually, he left the program in South Florida, returned home, and over the next 3 years, Alton just fell heavily into drugs. I think you and I can agree, Miss Diane, when I say that many young people are plagued with these, sort of predatory monsters that are kind of lurking in the grass, such as, the mental health issues and the drug abuse and things like that. Being a former probation officer, chief of probation, how much of this did you see, and what role did you play in trying to help young people overcome drug addiction?
So, I think a lot of people they don't really know what responsibilities that a probation officer has. And when it comes to, working in the probation office, what a lot of people don't know is probably, I would say, half of the people that we supervise have either an alcohol or drug problem, and 3/4 of the entire caseload, which, in Fremont, which was kind of my primary area that I worked, we had about 1,200 people on probation, and if you take half of that, which would be about 600 people that are on probation for drugs and or alcohol, and you couple that with 3/4 of everybody um, either was under the influence of alcohol or drugs when they committed their offense, we play a significant role in dealing with people who do have addictions. And, not everybody that comes through the probation office has an addiction, but, a good share of them do. So it's our responsibility as probation officers to do our very best to try to help these people, get better. That could be through referring people to treatment, AA meetings, NA meetings. It could even be as much as kind of holding them accountable by having them come in and drug test, every week, or even doing home visits. And sometimes I even know our staff would go out and, on a Friday or Saturday night, we would do something called bar checks. And, not that we were all that about, trying to get people in trouble, but, it's important when you have an addiction that people hold you accountable, because it's pretty easy to slip back into that cycle of drug use.
Right. So we talk about addiction, and I know that there's a stigma, obviously, to addiction. When we think about people that's addicted to something, like if I were to leave my house right now, walk down the street, and I see some guy leaned over a trash can under a bridge, and I look closely and I see he have a needle, towards his arm. What am I going to think about that guy immediately? Like, oh, he's scum of the earth or something like that. Those negative thoughts that come to our minds about, people that are addicted to something. I don't think, I think what would help most people to really get rid of that negative idea or that stigma that's attached to addiction is to understand what addiction is. Could you just define that briefly for us? Like, what is it? What is addiction?
So addiction is basically, if you want to think about addiction, it's first off, it's a chronic disease. And I don't think a lot of times we think of it that way. We think, well, it's my father-in-law used to always say, you can't say alcohol and drug addiction is a disease because, they caused it. It wasn't like cancer or those kind of things. That's an old way of thinking. Most medical, if not all medical professionals, see addiction as an actual chronic disease. And what makes it an addiction is, because to be honest, we all have addictions. I have chocolate addiction. That's going to send me to prison. But the former president of the United States had an addiction to Diet Coke. He even had a red button put in on his desk at the White House, and every time he rang it, it meant the butler was going to come in and bring him a Diet Coke. He got like 12. If you're drinking 12 Diet Cokes a day, that's an addiction. Now those things aren't going to get you in trouble, but an addiction is basically a chronic disease. And what makes the difference between like an addiction? It's where your whole mind is, all you can think about is that drug. You're in a constant state of compulsive, uncontrollable wanting of that drug. You can't think about anything else but the drug. And that generally is what we classify in this field as a bona fide addiction.
So when we think about addiction, I guess just to sum it up, it has some effect on the brain, if I'm not mistaken, some structural effects regarding how the brain functions. It affects that. How and why is it that drugs are so addicting? What makes drugs so addicting?
Some drugs are more addicting than others. Methamphetamine, cocaine, hydrocodone are going to be probably more addicting than others. You're going to have like marijuana, and that's going to have a less potential of being addicting. And I think what makes them addicting is your brain. So when you use drugs all the time, what it does is it causes your brain to always want it. It's that endorphin that you have, that, some of us get just naturally through like whatever it is that you enjoy. It makes you happy. People who use drugs, that's that piece of that brain that just keeps saying, give me more drugs, give me more drugs. So it's just, and like I said, some drugs are much more addictive than others. So
I remember, and I'll just share this personal story regarding like how your brain just sort of tells you like, hey, you need more, even though you're trying to rid yourself of it. Um, at age 16 or 14, I got addicted to pornography, and I watched pornography for over 10 years, nearly 10 years. I'm only 23. So like 8, 7 years. And it's something that I still struggle with in the sense that I think about it. I can see the images that I've watched years ago, and they come up in my mind again. And I'll tell my wife about it, like, hey, babe, I have this, this image that has returned to my mind, of a video that I watched, and it's like a consequence that I guess you can't get rid of because you've already indulged yourself in it. And most people think this is one of the primary reasons why you can't get over an addiction. So Ms. Diane, I mean, I know that you have a lot of, I know that you've dealt with this a lot in your field. And so what do you think about that? Is it possible to overcome a drug addiction?
Yes, it is possible to overcome an addiction. Just like you talked about, when you talked about your pornography addiction. First off, you're not alone in that. There are a lot of people that have struggled with that particular addiction. It doesn't mean that, you know, you're awful or those kinds of things. It means that you have something that you have to work on. And the first thing with all addictions, no matter if it's drug addiction, pornography addictions, food addictions, uh, vaping addiction, whatever your addiction is, the first thing you have to do in order to stop it or overcome it is you have to want to. And that's the hardest part for most people, is to want to do
Right.
that. But as you know, for most people, when you get to a point where you can no longer feel good about yourself and you're at, for lack of a better word, you've hit bottom, most people at that point want to make some changes. So the first way on how you get rid of an addiction is you have to want to. But wanting it is just isn't enough. You then have to take the steps to do things like, for instance, if it's a drug addiction, you have to then decide, look, I'm going to get some help. And that help could be as little as maybe support through your ministry, just somebody who can, be there when you need the help as far as to stay away from the drug. Like if you start thinking about the drug, maybe there's somebody you can call that can kind of talk to you a little bit about it. I actually happen to like the cognitive behavioral therapy approach, where it requires the person with the addiction to actually, I like to say, to get to the gut of the problem. Because when it comes to most of us, there's usually a problem that's hidden beneath layers of denial. So the first thing we have to do with our addictions is to get to the gut of what has caused that. For instance, my dad was an alcoholic, and I think a lot of the times that why he had so many problems is growing up, he was never wanted by his mom. And I think rather than deal with that, he had to get to the bottom of that and say, okay, it's really stemming from the fact that I don't feel like my mom ever loved me. And once you can put those things on the table and come to reality, and then start talking about it, most people can get better when it comes to their addiction. But they have to be honest, and B, they have to be willing to do the hard work of uncovering what's behind the addiction.
I think you're absolutely right. And thank you for the practical advice. Be honest and obviously be willing to do the hard work that comes along with getting over an addiction. I think another a thing that people relate to the difficulty that it takes to overcome an addiction is withdrawal, the severity of the symptoms of withdrawal. I remember watching an episode of Dr. Phil, and we were introduced to this girl named Cassie. She was 28 years old. And she said her addiction to drugs and alcohol was literally her life. And so at the point where she tried to stop, when she was ready to, as you stated, she hit rock bottom, she was ready to change her mind. Then she said withdrawal happened and she nearly died. They couldn't find veins in her arms because she had stuck so many needles in her arms. And once she got, hospitalized, she said that she was so close to death that she felt like drugs and alcohol had become her life. And so she felt, and this is her answer, that it was impossible to overcome an addiction. And what do you say to that? What do you say to people that feels that would a withdrawal, the symptoms of withdrawals literally hinders them from overcoming an addiction?
So that's common, particularly with drug abuse and particularly with methamphetamine, because here's the problem. When you use methamphetamine, it takes away, because remember, it's all part of it, it works into your brain. It a lot of times it takes away those endorphins that make us happy. And the more you use drugs, the more it takes away from your own ability to be able to be happy, and feel good. So even people who, so that's one reason why the withdrawal is so terrible with drug abuse, because like with an alcoholic, after 30 days of no drinking, the shaking and some of those kind of things, they go away and you start feeling better. But with drug abuse, particularly, methamphetamine and those, you can wait 30 days and it doesn't go away. You still have the cravings. You still, it's not disappearing. So, a lot of people frown on this. There's different ways you can deal with withdrawal. First off, there are some, legal drugs that you can take that can help a little bit with that. And, a lot of the Alcoholic Anonymous, you can't replace one drug with another. Well, we have to get real on this, because what do we want? These people to keep failing? So my thought is, okay, let's first see if one, through maybe counseling, through activities, through positive things like increasing your diet, better diet, just some of those first. I think all of us have to make sure we talk to our people that we're supervising with the natural kinds of things to get better before we immediately jump to a prescription drug. So I think first off, I would probably say to my folks on probation, okay, let's do this. When you start feeling these withdrawal symptoms, let's replace it with a positive activity, like possibly walking or listening to music or something that you really, that makes you feel good. And make sure you're watching your diet, stay away from caffeine, some of those kind of things. I would be cautioning on that. If that doesn't work, then I think I would go to plan B, and that would be to talk to the doctor about, what can I do to help me with some of these withdrawal symptoms. And I don't know that I personally think it's a wrong thing to do, to have some medicine if you need it. So those would be the two things, Dan, that I would be talking to my people about. For A, natural things, and B, the prescription medicine from a doctor.
Absolutely. I agree. I think like you stated before, your primary goal is to help those individuals get better.
Yes.
And I think the biggest argument for medical professionals and even parents and adults and teenagers today, they say that there's a difference between the addiction of a teenager and the early stages that they can experience that addiction that can really hinder the way their brain develops as they become adults. And so I just want to talk a little bit about that. How is there a greater risk for young people who are faced with drug addictions and things like that, rather than adults who are faced with drug addiction?
So I think we're looking at two different populations. We're looking at the adult addiction and the juvenile addiction. And yes, I think it's worse for young people. And both, first, let's be clear, addiction is bad for all people. But when it comes to adults and juveniles, you have to remember, when it comes to juveniles, the part of their brain is not yet developed, right? They're still trying, they're still maturing, they're still trying to grow up, so to speak. So when it comes to young people, I think about, their story is just beginning. They're still trying to figure out their world. And if they start using drugs early, and will it be the drug that writes their story, or will it be something else? And what we don't want young people to do is to get addicted to drugs, because first off, research shows that the brain, as it's developing, if you continue to use drugs, and the development of the brain may not fully develop like it should. And secondly, there's a long-term chance of these young kids having even more serious health risks. Also, when young kids are using drugs, they are more likely to engage in activities like legal trouble, wrongful sexual activities. Um, and, during your adolescent years, that's when you're starting to form your life, your relationships with people, your social skills, those kinds of things, the important events. And if you're using drugs, you're going to miss out on it. You're going to miss out on your prom. You're going to miss out on homecoming because all you're going to be thinking about is that drug. And the more kids use the drug, as we know, Dan, the more they crave the drug. And the more they use the drug, the more damage that's going to possibly do lifelong for them. And it could quite possibly affect their career choices, their jobs, and their ability to have a decent, happy adult life, which I think all people, all adolescents are entitled to. So I think it's worse when it comes to kids because they're just getting started. Their story is just beginning, and you don't want to ruin the story with addiction. So I think it's worse.
Right. I think you sort of made a great point when you said their story is just beginning. It reminds me of when looking over and preparing for this episode, I visited the University of Pittsburgh, their study on addiction, and I forget the doctor's name who actually leads that department, but she sort of gave this illustration of the mind of an adolescent. She said the if you were to view the adolescent's mind or brain as a functioning car, it would look something like this. So the amygdala, which processes the feelings and of reward and pain, and that matures sort of early. So that would be a full functioning gas pedal. Okay. So and
Yeah.
I think we can sort of look at teenagers and young adults and say, okay, yeah, for sure, they're definitely have their foot on the gas, so to speak, so that they go after their gut reactions, and young people sort of experience this type of euphorium high,
Yeah.
where which is associated with taking more risk and using substances, as it relates to drugs and things like that. But as the amygdala and all of this is functioning well, and they're sort of have their foot on the gas, they have weak brakes. Okay, and the weak brakes will be classified as like the prefrontal cortex, which assess the situations, make decisions. I mean, you use this part of your brain to make critical decisions. And I know you talk a lot in class about being a critical thinker. And sometimes I laugh because I'm thinking, well, they're adolescents. That part of the brain, that part of the brain hasn't probably developed all the way yet. So, but anyway, I mean, it's weak breaks. So they have when they make these decisions to go out and to indulge in drugs such as speed and cocaine and things like that, which are really addictive drugs. The moment they try to stop, I mean, it's difficult because now you can't. Your brakes are too weak. You can't slow down. You can't properly come to a halt and expect it all to end in one night. And so, what's the end result of that? I think you alluded to it. Some young people, they end up with a life of crime, doing criminal activity. They begin to feel a lot of pain, and their story, as you stated, is just beginning, and now it's being rewritten, so to speak, by addiction. And so another area that I want to kind of get into is relapse. When you talked about withdrawal, and I gave you the illustration of the girl that I saw on Dr. Phil, most people also allude to relapse as being a point in life where, hey, listen, I actually can't overcome this addiction. I failed. So how should we look at relapse? Should we look at it as a normal part of the journey? It's inevitable. It's going to happen, or how should we view that?
So, like I had said a little bit earlier, people have to remember that addiction is a chronic disease. And with chronic diseases, it's likely that no matter, just take cancer for an example, you can go into remission with cancer and it pops back again. So the same way goes with addiction. So it is something that people are going to battle for their entire life. It's not going to go away. We want it to go away. People want to just pretend it never happened. That attitude will get them, even more into lots of relapse. So you have to, I think, when it comes to, at least for us in the probation field, we used to say, expect relapse, not to them, but to our own selves. So we wouldn't be so quick when they would use again to want to just revoke probation and send them to jail. That's what we did in the 1980s and to some degree in the 1990s. But when 2000 came around and I took over the district in 2003, the tide was shifting, and it was shifting more toward, look, we can't be so quick to throw everybody in jail for an addiction. So we started then to, look at other avenues like, okay, expect relapse. So what you do on that, when you say that it's a normal part of the journey to sobriety, you have to just expect that. Now, that doesn't mean we have to accept that. You expect that, but not accept it. So what you do with folks who relapse, you say to them, look, you're not a failure. You're a success because you had 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks of sobriety. So now let's start again. Let's begin today on another journey called success, called sobriety. And then what you do then with the folks who relapse is you tighten up on some of the programming. You might put them back in an NA meeting every night. You might hook them up with the sponsor, somebody who also has had addiction, who's been in a sobriety for 5-10 years. You give them a friend. You might refer them to a minister, somebody, and then you involve their family and you say, okay, we need some reinforcement here. You guys, they're struggling, and you counsel your person to say, look, when you're starting to feel like you might want to use drugs, reach out to your mom or your husband or your dad, so you start, and then you try to keep them away from triggers. Like, for instance, for a kid, if a trigger is hanging out with a certain kid, then stay away from that kid. So those are kind of the things that we have to be very, very careful when it comes to relapse, to not just holler at somebody and say, God, I can't believe you did that. You're terrible. And you continually offer positive reinforcement and support to addicts because it's a chronic disease and they're trying. So again, you also have to have, though, when we talk about this, Dan, they have to want to try too. I mean, if they don't want to try, then you have to then look at something different. So we're going to look at the bright side and think these folks are wanting to get better.
Right, right. And I think you alluded to something very important. I know that this is a podcast primarily tailored towards, younger people, but as young people listen to it, they have parents. And so when you talked about it basically takes a cooperative effort. So you have to have an ally, so to speak, someone that you can rely on that's not going to cause you to relapse. And if you do relapse, someone who's going to encourage you that, hey, listen, it happened. Let's move forward. Again, I told you about my addiction to pornography. I actually still, I still am subscribed to an app called Covenant Eyes. And what Covenant Eyes do, they monitor everything. So you have a VPN set up on all my devices. My wife is my guardian angel. That's the title on the app.
Yeah.
But when you look at it from a parent's perspective, sometimes parents have a more difficult time trying to encourage their children. They almost kind of blur the lines between encouragement and enabling them. And so, what practical advice could you give as far as to help family members or parents really just help their struggling teenager overcome an addiction?
Well, first off, I think as hard as it is, as a parent of 3 of my own children who have all, they are all adults now. I've experienced, some of my own kinds of issues. I've not had to deal with, addiction as far as, drugs go with my kids, but I certainly have seen it with the families that I work with in probation. And I think what we have to remember as parents, if you have kids that have addiction, is you have to be extremely supportive. And that's hard because you're so worried. It's hard to be supportive when you're worried sick. but you have to continue to always be positive and supportive. It depends upon, when it comes to your child, it depends upon the level of their issue. For instance, if you're concerned about, the fact that they are experimenting with marijuana or even, some other drug, ecstasy, whatever it might be, and if they're in an experimental stage, then what you as a parent do is be a parent and start then imposing rules. Um, Curfews, you have the right to do that. Curfews, monitoring their friends, monitoring their phone usage. And you just have to remind your kid that I'm not doing this to be mean. I care about you and I want you to have a wonderful life, and I'm doing my job. I'm I'm worried, and I don't think it hurts your kids to hear their parents say, I'm worried, I'm scared, and I want you to have a good life. I think if the addiction is more serious, where they're not going to school and they're not getting out of bed, where you would see more of a more serious sort of a problem, then I think you're going to have to get help. I think at that point you need to, uh, find a therapist, a alcohol drug counselor, depending on what the addiction is. And I think you're going to have to elicit support with some professional who's trained to deal with those kinds of issues. So I just think when I talk to parents, I think you have to first evaluate the problem. And if it is a problem as far as, experimenting, I think you can lay some rules down. But I also think parents have to realize that our kids are watching us. And so that means we as parents have to demonstrate responsible, good behavior. It's pretty hard on a kid to tell them that they can't be doing, using marijuana when perhaps you and your husband are sitting in the living room smoking marijuana when they go to bed at night. So I think the best thing we can do as parents is to be good role models. I mean, really good role models. They see us, our actions, more than they hear us. So I think one thing for parents is to make sure that, you're modeling good behavior. And if you are, then I think, as I used to tell most parents, look, you're good parents, you've got a good house here, you've got good structure. He or she's going to be okay if you
Absolutely.
take the precautions you need.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. That credibility piece is very important. Being a young father, I know I catch myself watching my actions and what I say more closely, even though my son is only 6 months.
Right.
I just don't want to, be that hindrance from him doing something remarkable with his life in a positive way. And so I think when we talk about young people, and I know you alluded to earlier about young people actually, wanting the help, um, in some cases they don't want the help. And I think even we had an officer in class a few days ago, and he talked about how difficult it was to actually get people to comply with the police. And in my mind, I would think that would be the easiest thing. And so what do you think as far as like the signs that we can look for, the specific signs that we can look for in young people who are at risk for drug abuse, especially considering that they may not want to talk about it? Are there some signs that we can look for to help them?
Yeah, I think some of those things would be, are they isolating themselves first off? Are they, do they show a lack of motivation? Are they having anger outbursts, or they're not acting like themselves? A lot of times when you're concerned that maybe your child is using drugs, they might have some, like I said before, emotional or mental withdrawings. A lot of times our kids, when they're doing things that they're not supposed to do, they isolate. They won't talk to you. Uh, One, out of shame, particularly if you're a family that they know doesn't approve of the behavior. So some things that you can look for are, I think, like I said, anxiousness, inattentiveness, lack of motivation, um, mood swings. Those kind of things are target things I think parents need to watch for. The most important thing that I used to see in the field is watch for them. Many of our parents, that not many, but some, weren't all that involved with their kids, weren't interested in their well-being, and that's that's a problem, and it's usually something that contributes to a lot of the kids having drug problems is
Absolutely.
inattentive parents.
Absolutely. I think most people, I think you just alluded to a great point as far as parents being involved with their children. One thing that I guess used to sort of enable me with my pornography addiction was the fact that my mom worked overnights, and so I was often left alone at home, and so I could pretty much, I had the freedom to do whatever I want. We had no restrictions or codes on our phones or any of our devices, so it was just that easy to, sort of access those sites that would, obviously be of some great hindrance later down the line in life. And so I think that's a great point. Just being able to know where your kids are, obviously be involved, talk with them about it. I believe that's a very important thing to do. But also, when we allude to kids, young people in general, and their drug addiction, would you say that drug addiction is a mental health issue? Would you say that, if so, or if not, would you say that drug addiction can lead to a mental health issue?
So the answer to that is no, addiction is not a mental health issue. It's not. They're two totally separate issues. It's it is a what I will say about drug addiction and mental health is a lot of folks who have mental illness will use drugs as a way to numb some of their effects of the mental illness, but they're two separate issues and two separate problems. You will find folks who have mental illness also have drug problems. And usually the drug addiction is due to, not being able to deal with the symptoms of their mental illness. So they smoke marijuana or they get involved with prescription drugs to help numb the pain, so to speak. So I think they're totally different issues as far as those kind of things. So
Absolutely. So, if I'm understanding it correctly, then the most of the times the drugs that are taken are used as a way to sort of numb the mind or numb the pain that they have from the mental health issue.
yes,
Okay.
that's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay. Okay. So again, I think I shared with you before about, my mom and the things that she struggled with as far as her mental health. She's much better now, thankfully.
Thank
But
goodness.
they're right. There's still a lot of things that she doesn't like, about medication and stuff like that. Like, she doesn't like to feel numb. But I think some of the young people that I've talked to, um, who were addicted to drugs or any other substance, that they always stated to me that it was a way for them to release themselves from the pain, from the agony of life, from the hurt of maybe a divorce, from the pain of maybe abuse that they were receiving at home. And so I think you alluded to it earlier. The way the family environment that you have plays a large role, especially in the lives of young people and how they will ultimately react to that. And so, have you ever, in your line of work, your former line of work, have you ever dealt with families who definitely had children that were addicted to drugs because of their environment at home?
Oh, I think probably most of the families that I worked with that had drug addictions and I don't want to say mental health issues because I don't think that's the same, but I definitely believe that drug usage, addictions, those kind of things. One thing that you see quite a bit is you see family involvement in drugs. So you'll see some genetics that play into drug addiction. But I also think that for a lot of families that I dealt with, a lot of times the kids that had these addictive behaviors, families, a lot of times the parents were to blame. They weren't home, they didn't supervise, they weren't present. And I think I used to say with parents, um, if you don't care for them, they won't grow up right. It's kind of like a flower, if you don't water them and care for them, they never get pretty. You have to nurture. And I think parents, a lot of times that have kids through the court system, they don't always do the job that they need to do as far as the nurturing and the support and those kind of things. But yet on the other side of it, a lot of parents that we would deal with, it's not that they didn't want to try, it's that they never had any good role modeling themselves. So just because we might have problems with parenting doesn't mean that parents can't get better. And that's part of a job of a probation officer, is to try to help parents, do more structured things with their kids so that they can grow up to have good lives too. So I think a lot of how parents are is a lot of what they saw when they were growing up. So it's this genetic factor that gets in the way.
Absolutely. Again, obviously, our conversation is on this issue is very prevalent. Trying to motivate, young people who obviously have struggled with that, or maybe people that are listening still struggle with some type of addiction. It may not be drugs, maybe it's pornography, maybe it's an addiction to a video game or whatever. But it's the point that you can overcome it. And I think your remarks towards that were very great and obviously useful. So as we come to an end of this episode, I want to finish off with Alton's story. He stole a car when he went back to Michigan and ended up in a graveyard. He looked around, and for that brief moment in his life, for a long time, he was sober and thought to himself, like, hey, if I don't change, I'm going to end up like one of these individuals that I'm viewing right now. I'm going to end up 6 feet under if I don't change my life. And so, being that he recognized that he had an issue, he fell on the ground, head bowed, and immediately began to cry out to God, asking God to help him, to relieve him of the stress, of the pain that those drugs had, caused him. And so eventually, he got up, left the graveyard, and the guy was immediately arrested. Okay. He was taken to jail, and he met a woman named Jane Patterson. And Miss Diane, I'm just going to tell you right up front, I think, to me, you remind me a lot of Miss Jane Patterson, which is why I thought you were perfect, for this podcast. And Miss Jane, she was a woman who ascribed to Christianity. She was his public defender, and she was assigned to his case. And when she met this guy, she started crying. And she looked at him and she said, I knew behind that manly, that huge body of his, that there was a little boy inside saying, help me. She began to look intently at his case, and she got the charges brought down to a misdemeanor. Unfortunately, though, about 2 months later, he relapsed. And we talked about that. Most people, they would view relapse as a failed mission. I can't do this. But Miss Jane, she couldn't sleep at night. She thought that there was something more that she can do. And so what she did, she talked to her husband, and they decided to give Alton some money to go to a rehab treatment center in Argentina. And while he was there, he realized that he was more than football. He realized that he was more than weightlifting. He was more than an athlete, but that he was a human being who had messed up and now can have another chance if he decides, as you stated before, if he decides that he doesn't want to live that lifestyle anymore. He got a chance to play football again, and it was remarkable because for the first time in his life, he wasn't playing football because he lived for football. He was playing football for a hobby, but he
Yeah.
lived for God. He's still sober today, living drug free. And it's because of Miss Jane Patterson and other people who helped him, and obviously him making up his mind and God having an influence in his life, that he's able to be drug free. And so
Cool
I think that's a
story.
remarkable, right? I think that's a remarkable story of a guy who faced the odds and got a chance to play football again. And Miss Jane Patterson, who reminds me again so much of you, I think that you will go out your way to help people. You've told us stories about you going out your way to help people, and even now, just doing this podcast, I know that you'll do whatever you can for your students. And so, that's my special, thank you to you. Thank you for being on the show, for taking time to share some practical knowledge and advice, not only for me but for those listening. And is there anything that you want to say before we head out?
No, just thank you for the opportunity to talk with you about this super important, topic about drug addiction. So, no, I think I would end with, everybody should have a chance to have a wonderful life.
Well, Ms. Diane, I appreciate you so much for setting aside this time in your evening to be on the podcast with me. And I know for sure that this episode will add value to lives of many. So thank you again, Ms. Diane.
Thank you for having me.
As we conclude today's episode, give ear to the words of the Apostle Paul. 1 Corinthians 10:13 reads, "No temptation has overtaken you except something common to mankind, and God is faithful, so he will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it." Verse 14, "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry." See, the message that Paul was trying to convey to the Corinthians was that whenever we begin to think that no one else is or has experienced what we are experiencing at the time, we begin to think incorrectly. We begin to think that we are alone. But in actuality, in reality, we're not alone. For those who may be addicted to drugs, maybe you feel alone. Please understand that you are never alone. There is someone out there who has went through the same trials, who have went through and experienced the same pain that you have experienced. Please reach out for help to help you overcome drug addiction. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. Please, again, leave a review, leave a rating, as this will help with the exposure of the podcast. And be sure to share this episode with your friends. Thank you so much.